Across the Quiet Hellespont, the Young King and the Silent Sea. Long ago, in the gentle stillness of the ancient world, there was a young king who stood beside a quiet stretch of sea. The morning air was cool. A soft wind moved slowly across the water. The sky was painted in pale colors of early dawn, and the sea reflected the light like a calm mirror. This narrow body of water was known in ancient times as the Hellespont. Today, many people know it as the Dardanelles. But on this quiet morning, more than 2,000 years ago, the place felt calm and almost ordinary. Yet history was about to begin moving forward from this very shore. Standing near the water was a young king named Alexander the Great. He was only 22 years old. His hair was light brown and fell softly around his shoulders. His eyes were bright and thoughtful, always looking toward distant places. Behind him stood rows of soldiers from the kingdom of Macedon. They were strong, well-trained, and disciplined. Their bronze armor reflected the morning sunlight, and their long spears stood upright like a forest of silver lines. These soldiers had marched many miles together. They trusted their young king. But today was different. Today they were not preparing for a march across land. They were preparing to cross the sea. And on the far side of that sea waited a vast and powerful empire. It was the great Achaemenid Empire, a kingdom that stretched across enormous lands and countless cities. Many people believed that no army could truly challenge such a powerful empire. But Alexander had a different dream. He believed that careful planning, brave soldiers, and strong leadership could overcome even the greatest obstacles. Still, on that quiet morning, there was no rushing. The sea itself seemed peaceful, as if it understood the importance of the moment. Gentle waves rolled slowly toward the shore. Seabirds glided through the air above the water. Along the beach, wooden ships waited patiently. They were long warships built from strong timber. Their sails were neatly folded. Their ropes were tied carefully to wooden posts in the sand. Nearby stood one of Alexander's most trusted generals, Parmenion. Parmenion had seen many battles. His beard had turned gray from years of service and experience. He understood that this crossing was not just a simple journey. Crossing the Hellespont meant entering Asia, and once the army stepped onto that land, there would be no easy turning back. But on that quiet morning, the mood among the soldiers was calm. They had trained for years. They had marched through mountains and valleys. They believed in their king. As the sun slowly climbed higher in the sky, the morning light spread across the water. The ships began to prepare for departure. Sailors loosened ropes. They raised large sails that caught the gentle wind. One by one, soldiers carefully stepped onto the wooden decks. Their armor clinked softly as they moved. Alexander walked toward his own ship. Before stepping aboard, he paused for a moment. He turned his head and looked back toward the land of Macedon. This was the place where he had grown up. The hills, the rivers, the familiar fields. For a moment, everything was quiet. Then he stepped onto the ship. The ropes were released. The ship slowly pushed away from the shore. At first, the movement was gentle. The ships drifted slowly over the calm water. Then the wind filled the sails, and the fleet began to move forward. From above, the ships might have looked like a line of quiet birds gliding across the sea. The crossing of the Hellespont was not long, but symbolically it was enormous. For centuries, stories had been told of warriors crossing this same water during the legendary Trojan War. Now, a new chapter was beginning. Slowly, the distant coastline began to appear. Soft hills rose above the water. Green land stretched across the horizon. This was Asia Minor. The ships moved closer and closer. The soldiers watched quietly. No one shouted, no one rushed. There was only the quiet sound of waves touching the sides of the ships. Finally, the ships reached the shore. Wooden ramps were lowered. Alexander stepped forward. He walked down from the ship and placed his foot onto the land of Asia. According to ancient stories, he threw a spear into the ground ahead of him. It was a symbolic act, a quiet declaration that this new land would now become part of his journey. But at that moment, the world itself remained calm. The wind moved gently across the shore. The sea continued its slow rhythm behind them. And far ahead, beyond hills and rivers and cities, a long road of history was waiting. The crossing of the Hellespont had been completed, and with that quiet step onto new land, a journey had begun that would slowly change the map of the ancient world. But tonight, as we listen to this story, we remember the beginning. A calm sea, a quiet morning, and a young king stepping into history. The quiet landing in Asia. The morning mist still floated gently across the waters of the Hellespont as the Macedonian ships approached the quiet coast of Asia Minor. The sea had been calm during the crossing. Soft waves touched the sides of the wooden ships as the oars moved in steady rhythm. The sound of wood against water created a slow and peaceful pattern that echoed across the strait. For many of the soldiers, this was the first time they had ever seen the lands of Asia. They had marched across Macedonia, through Thrace, and down to the edge of the Hellespont. They had slept beneath cold stars and warm campfires. But this moment felt different. Ahead of them lay an entire continent. Alexander stood silently at the front of his ship. The morning wind moved through his golden hair, and his red cloak drifted softly behind him. The young king did not speak. He simply watched the distant shoreline grow clearer with every passing moment. Behind him, rows of Macedonian soldiers sat quietly with their shields resting beside them. Their long sarissa spears were stacked neatly along the deck. The men understood something important. They were not simply crossing a narrow sea. They were stepping into history. Hephaestion stood nearby, his eyes also fixed on the land ahead. "Asia," he said quietly. Alexander nodded slowly. "Yes," he replied. The coastline of Asia Minor slowly emerged from the morning mist. Rocky hills rose gently above the water. Patches of green trees covered the slopes, and small streams flowed toward the sea. It looked peaceful, almost too peaceful. The fleet moved steadily closer to the shore. Sailors lowered the sails, while the rowers guided the ships carefully through the shallow water. Soon the first ship touched the sand. A quiet moment followed. No cheering, no shouting, only the sound of waves against the beach. Alexander stepped forward. For a brief moment he stood still at the edge of the ship. This land had once been ruled by Greek cities centuries before. Now it belonged to the vast Persian Empire. But history was never fixed. Empires rose, empires fell, and today a new chapter was beginning. Alexander lifted his spear and stepped down from the ship onto the shore. The sand shifted slightly beneath his sandals. For the first time, the young king of Macedonia stood on the soil of Asia. Some historians would later write that he threw his spear into the ground, claiming Asia as a land won by the spear. Whether that moment happened exactly that way or not, the meaning remained the same. Alexander had come not as a visitor, but as a conqueror. Behind him, the Macedonian soldiers began to disembark from the ships. Boots stepped onto the sand. Armor reflected the rising sun. Banners carrying the symbol of Macedon lifted slowly in the morning wind. Yet the scene remained strangely quiet. There were no Persian soldiers waiting on the shore, no defenses, no walls. the landing had been peaceful. Alexander walked a short distance along the beach, studying the coastline carefully. Hephaestion followed beside him. "The Persians expected us somewhere else," Hephaestion said calmly. Alexander looked toward the hills beyond the shore. "They will not ignore us for long." Scouts soon began moving inland, exploring the nearby roads and valleys. Reports slowly returned. The nearest Persian forces were still gathering farther inland. The Macedonian landing had been faster than expected. Speed had once again given Alexander an advantage. By midday, the entire army had crossed the Hellespont. Thousands of soldiers now stood on Asian soil. Cavalry horses were led carefully from the ships. Supply wagons were unloaded. Engineers examined the shoreline, planning the next march. The army began forming into long marching columns. Yet before leaving the coast, Alexander did something unexpected. He walked alone toward a nearby rise overlooking the sea. From there, he could see the narrow strait they had just crossed. The Hellespont shimmered quietly in the sunlight. Beyond it lay Europe. Behind him stretched Asia. The distance between those two worlds was small, yet the meaning of the crossing was enormous. Alexander stood silently for several moments. The wind carried the scent of salt water and distant grasslands. He did not celebrate. He did not boast. Instead, he simply looked forward, because the journey ahead would not be easy. Somewhere beyond the hills, Persian generals were already gathering their armies. Satraps and commanders had begun sending messages across the empire. The invader had arrived. Soon the quiet coast of Asia Minor would become the stage for the first great battle of Alexander's campaign. But for now, the army rested beneath the warm sun of a new continent. Soldiers drank water and adjusted their armor. Horses grazed along the grassy slopes. The ships rested calmly in the harbor. For a brief moment in history, the world seemed still. Yet the silence would not last forever. The invasion of Asia had begun, and the first battle was already approaching.
The river that waited. Night slowly settled over the quiet plains of Asia Minor. The Macedonian army had marched several miles inland since leaving the coast of the Hellespont. Behind them, the sea had faded into memory, replaced by rolling hills, gentle valleys, and winding rivers that flowed through the fertile land. Small campfires flickered across the fields. Thousands of soldiers rested beneath the wide night sky. Some sat quietly polishing their armor. Others sharpened spear tips or adjusted the straps of their shields. Horses grazed slowly along the grassy slopes, while the distant sound of crickets filled the warm evening air. At the center of the camp stood the royal tent. Inside, Alexander studied a large map spread across a wooden table. The map showed the rivers, roads, and cities of Asia Minor. Lines of ink marked the known routes through the land, though many areas remained uncertain. Beside him stood Hephaestion, his closest companion and trusted general. "The scouts returned not long ago," Hephaestion said calmly. Alexander looked up from the map. What did they see? Hephaestion pointed toward a curved line drawn across the parchment. The Granicus River. The name hung quietly in the air. Alexander studied the map again. The Granicus River was not large compared to the great rivers of the Persian Empire, but it flowed through steep banks and rocky ground, creating a natural defensive line. More importantly, Persian forces were gathering there. Satraps from nearby provinces had begun assembling an army to block the Macedonian advance. For the first time since landing in Asia, Alexander would face a serious military challenge. Outside the tent, the night wind moved softly through the grass.
Alexander stepped outside and looked toward the distant darkness of the inland hills. Somewhere beyond those hills flowed the Granicus. Somewhere along that river, Persian cavalry and infantry were preparing to meet him. Yet Alexander's expression remained calm. He had expected this moment. The invasion of Asia had always been a race between speed and resistance. The faster he moved, the less time the Persian Empire would have to organize its enormous resources. And so far, speed had been on his side. Hephaestion joined him outside the tent. "The Persian commanders believe the river will stop us," he said calmly. Alexander smiled slightly. "Rivers have stopped many armies," he replied, "but not all of them." In the distance, the fires of the Macedonian camp glowed like scattered stars across the dark land. Thousands of soldiers had followed Alexander across the Hellespont. Farmers, craftsmen, hunters, and veterans of earlier campaigns. They had left their homes in Macedonia and Greece to follow a young king into the unknown lands of Asia. For many of them, tomorrow would bring their first real battle. Alexander knew this. He also knew something else. The first battle of a campaign often decided the confidence of an entire army. Victory would open the road deeper into Asia. Defeat would trap them far from home. He looked again toward the dark hills beyond the camp. "The river will not wait forever," he said quietly. Morning arrived slowly. Golden sunlight spread across the plains as the Macedonian army prepared to march. Soldiers packed their equipment and formed into marching columns. Horses were saddled. Supply wagons rolled forward. Dust rose gently as thousands of boots moved across the dry earth. Scouts rode ahead of the army, watching the roads and hills. By midday, the landscape began to change. The ground sloped downward into a wide valley where a river cut through the land. Tall grass grew along the banks. Smooth stones filled the shallow water. The Granicus River. From a distance, it appeared peaceful, but the opposite bank told a different story. Across the river stood the Persian army. Bright armor flashed in the sunlight. Hundreds of cavalry riders waited along the steep riverbank, their horses restless and alert. Behind them stood ranks of infantry soldiers. Their banners moved in the wind. The Persians had chosen their position carefully. The river formed a natural barrier. Any army attempting to cross would have to fight uphill against defenders already waiting above the bank. Many commanders would have chosen to wait, to search for another crossing, to delay the battle until a better opportunity appeared. But Alexander was not known for waiting. He studied the river carefully. The water was not deep, but the current was strong enough to slow advancing soldiers. The banks were steep in several places. Crossing would not be easy, yet the Macedonian army had trained for difficult battles. Alexander rode slowly along the line of his soldiers. The men watched him quietly. They had marched far to reach this moment. Many of them felt the nervous energy that always comes before a battle. Alexander stopped near the front ranks of the cavalry. The horses shifted impatiently beneath their riders. Across the river, Persian commanders watched carefully. They expected hesitation. They expected the Macedonians to delay. Instead, Alexander raised his spear. The signal moved quickly down the line. Trumpets sounded across the field. The Macedonian cavalry began moving forward toward the river. Dust rose behind them as the horses accelerated. Water splashed as the first riders entered the current. The Battle of the Granicus was about to begin. From the Persian side, arrows and spears began flying across the river. But the Macedonian riders did not stop. They pushed forward through the water, climbing the opposite bank, while enemy cavalry rushed to meet them. The calm river valley suddenly erupted with movement and noise. Steel clashed against steel. Horses reared and turned as riders fought along the steep banks. Alexander himself rode near the front of the attack. His red cloak moved behind him as his horse climbed the slippery bank. For a moment, Alexander stood directly among the fighting. History would later remember this battle as the first great test of Alexander's campaign. But in that moment, it was simply chaos. Dust, water, shouting, and the flash of weapons. Yet slowly, the balance of the battle began to shift. Macedonian discipline and coordination pushed the Persian cavalry backward. More soldiers crossed the river behind the first wave. The Macedonian army was gaining ground. By late afternoon, the Persian line began to break. Some cavalry units retreated. Others attempted to regroup farther up the valley. But the momentum had already turned. The Granicus River had not stopped Alexander. Instead, it had become the first battlefield of his conquest. As the sun began to lower toward the horizon, the valley slowly grew quiet again. The river flowed calmly through the land as it always had, but history had changed along its banks. The road into Asia now lay open, and this was only the beginning.
Across the whispering plains, Alexander's journey continues. The early morning mist hovered over the plains of Asia Minor, soft and silver, brushing against the grass like a gentle hand. The Macedonian army, still resting from the battle at the Granicus River, slowly stirred. Horses shifted their weight, snorted softly, and the faint clinking of armor echoed like whispers across the fields. Alexander, standing slightly apart from his soldiers, watched the first rays of sunlight stretch across the valley. Each blade of grass seemed to catch fire with the morning light, glimmering like tiny lanterns. He breathed in the cool air, feeling the calm before the storm of the journey ahead. The river, now quieter, reflected the orange and rose hues of the sky. The landscape seemed almost unreal in its serenity. The soldiers, weary but alert, began their quiet preparations. Some adjusted the straps of their armor, others examined their weapons. The horses, sensing the calm, nuzzled their riders gently or grazed quietly, ears twitching at distant birdsong. Alexander's mind wandered, as it often did in these quiet moments, to the larger purpose of the campaign, the Hellespont, the promise of crossing into Asia, and the untold lands that lay beyond. He envisioned each city, each fortress, each river and mountain he would soon see, all unknown and waiting. Yet there was no rush now. The day was young, and the world seemed to breathe alongside him. Hephaestion approached, his steps quiet upon the soft earth. "The men are ready, Alexander," he said in a calm, steady voice. The words barely disturbed the silence, blending with the gentle ripple of the river. Alexander nodded, feeling the weight of leadership settle comfortably upon him. "Then let us begin," he murmured. Not a command shouted, but a soft invitation, a promise that the journey was as much about thought and observation as it was about conquest. The soldiers fell into ordered ranks, each step measured and deliberate. The dust of the previous day's battle had settled into the earth, leaving the ground firm and smooth beneath their sandals and hooves. Macedonian cavalry moved forward first, the rhythmic sound of hooves blending with the soft murmur of the river nearby. Their armor caught the sunlight, glinting softly like stars fallen to earth. Alexander's horse led the column, hooves steady, eyes alert, mane waving gently in the breeze.
As they progressed across the plains, small details came into view. A heron lifting silently from the riverbank, a fox disappearing into the brush, the faint hum of insects. These were the quiet moments, often unnoticed, that the soldiers and leaders alike would remember long after the clamor of battle had faded. Alexander paused briefly to watch a doe stepping carefully through tall grass, her ears alert, eyes wide and cautious. There was a lesson in her movement, he thought. Patience, observation, balance. The march continued, slow and deliberate. Hills rose and fell in gentle waves, and the Macedonian army moved over them like a living river, golden armor glinting intermittently in the sunlight. Alexander's thoughts drifted to strategy, but they were soft, like clouds over the plains, not sharp and urgent as in battle. He considered the rivers ahead, the cities, the unknown resistance, and the lands that waited beyond each horizon. Every decision required not only courage, but reflection. Today's calm was the prelude to tomorrow's action. By mid-morning, the army approached a small village nestled between gentle hills and a meandering stream. Smoke rose lazily from chimneys, curling into the air like thin ribbons of silk. The villagers, curious but wary, watched the Macedonian soldiers pass. Alexander kept his eyes on the patterns of the land, the bridges, the narrow passes, the low hills that could hide an ambush. Yet the scene remained peaceful. Children waved shyly, and goats grazed on the gentle slopes. For a moment, the weight of empire seemed distant, replaced by the quiet rhythm of life. Hephaestion approached, his steps quiet upon the soft earth. "The men are ready, Alexander," he said in a calm, steady voice. The words barely disturbed the silence, blending with the gentle ripple of the river. Alexander nodded, feeling the weight of leadership settle comfortably upon him. "Then let us begin," he murmured. Not a command shouted, but a soft invitation, a promise that the journey was as much about thought and observation as it was about conquest. The soldiers fell into ordered ranks, each step measured and deliberate. The dust of the previous day's battle had settled into the earth, leaving the ground firm and smooth beneath their sandals and hooves. Macedonian cavalry moved forward first, the rhythmic sound of hooves blending with the soft murmur of the river nearby. Their armor caught the sunlight, glinting softly like stars fallen to earth. Alexander's horse led the column, hooves steady, eyes alert, mane waving gently in the breeze. As they progressed across the plains, small details came into view. A heron lifting silently from the riverbank, a fox disappearing into the brush, the faint hum of insects. These were the quiet moments, often unnoticed, that the soldiers and leaders alike would remember long after the clamor of battle had faded. Alexander paused briefly to watch a doe stepping carefully through tall grass, her ears alert, eyes wide and cautious. There was a lesson in her movement, he thought. Patience, observation, balance. The march continued, slow and deliberate. Hills rose and fell in gentle waves, and the Macedonian army moved over them like a living river, golden armor glinting intermittently in the sunlight. Alexander's thoughts drifted to strategy, but they were soft, like clouds over the plains, not sharp and urgent as in battle. He considered the rivers ahead, the cities, the unknown resistance, and the lands that waited beyond each horizon. Every decision required not only courage, but reflection. Today's calm was the prelude to tomorrow's action. By mid-morning, the army approached a small village nestled between gentle hills and a meandering stream. Smoke rose lazily from chimneys, curling into the air like thin ribbons of silk. The villagers, curious but wary, watched the Macedonian soldiers pass. Alexander kept his eyes on the patterns of the land,
the bridges, the narrow passes, the low hills that could hide an ambush. Yet the scene remained peaceful. Children waved shyly, and goats grazed on the gentle slopes. For a moment, the weight of empire seemed distant, replaced by the quiet rhythm of life. Hephaestion approached, his steps quiet upon the soft earth. "The men are ready, Alexander," he said in a calm, steady voice. The words barely disturbed the silence, blending with the gentle ripple of the river. Alexander nodded, feeling the weight of leadership settle comfortably upon him. "Then let us begin," he murmured. Not a command shouted, but a soft invitation, a promise that the journey was as much about thought and observation as it was about conquest. The soldiers fell into ordered ranks, each step measured and deliberate. The dust of the previous day's battle had settled into the earth, leaving the ground firm and smooth beneath their sandals and hooves. Macedonian cavalry moved forward first, the rhythmic sound of hooves blending with the soft murmur of the river nearby. Their armor caught the sunlight, glinting softly like stars fallen to earth. Alexander's horse led the column, hooves steady, eyes alert, mane waving gently in the breeze. As they progressed across the plains, small details came into view: a heron lifting silently from the riverbank, a fox disappearing into the brush, the faint hum of insects. These were the quiet moments, often unnoticed, that the soldiers and leaders alike would remember long after the clamor of battle had faded. Alexander paused briefly to watch a doe stepping carefully through tall grass, her ears alert, eyes wide and cautious. There was a lesson in her movement, he thought: patience, observation, balance. The march continued, slow and deliberate. Hills rose and fell in gentle waves, and the Macedonian army moved over them like a living river, golden armor glinting intermittently in the sunlight. Alexander's thoughts drifted to strategy, but they were soft, like clouds over the plains, not sharp and urgent as in battle. He considered the rivers ahead, the cities, the unknown resistance, and the lands that waited beyond each horizon. Every decision required not only courage, but reflection. Today's calm was the prelude to tomorrow's action. By mid-morning, the army approached a small village nestled between gentle hills and a meandering stream.
The crossing of the whispering waters. Alexander moves forward. The dawn rose gently over the Hellespont, casting soft pink and gold hues across the calm waters. Mist clung to the riverbanks and drifted lazily over the waves, curling like silver ribbons. The Macedonian army had reached the narrow strait, the first real boundary between their homelands and the vast unknown of Asia. Alexander stood upon a gentle rise, watching the water reflect the awakening sky. The soldiers moved quietly below, preparing their vessels and checking their equipment with careful hands. The sea itself seemed to pause, awaiting the moment when these determined men would cross it. Alexander's gaze traveled from the opposite shore to the horizon beyond. He imagined the lands that waited, the cities, forests, and rivers, each unknown and full of possibility. The Hellespont was more than a river. It was a symbol of transition, a bridge between the familiar and the new, a silent witness to what was to come. Hephaestion approached, his steps muted on the soft earth. "The men are ready," he said softly. Alexander nodded, feeling the quiet weight of responsibility settle over him. Not a rush, not a command, only the gentle determination of preparation. "Then we shall begin," he murmured, his voice barely more than the whisper of grass over wind. The soldiers formed orderly lines, carrying ropes, poles, and small provisions. Boats awaited at the water's edge, their wooden hulls gleaming faintly in the first rays of sunlight. Horses were led carefully into shallow water, hooves splashing softly. The calm rhythm of the morning
carried a sense of reverence, as if the river itself were acknowledging the purpose of the army. Alexander walked slowly along the front lines, noting the alignment of boats, the readiness of soldiers, the weight of each pack, and the sturdiness of each vessel. Every small detail mattered. A misstep here could cost not only time, but lives. Yet in the calm of early morning, every man seemed aligned with a single purpose, their hearts steady with quiet courage. The crossing began, first with small rafts carrying provisions and the lighter cavalry, horses carefully led across, soldiers guiding them with gentle hands. The water rippled, reflecting the sun's ascent, creating small diamonds of light that danced across the surface. Alexander watched from the bank, noting each movement, calculating timing and coordination, yet allowing space for the natural flow of the river. Hephaestion rode beside the first rafts, his calm demeanor a reassuring presence. Soldiers murmured quietly among themselves, the soft sounds of hooves and water blending in a gentle symphony. Alexander's attention remained fixed on the progress, but his heart allowed a moment of wonder. The river was both obstacle and partner, shaping the pace of the army's advance. By mid-morning, the first wave of infantry had reached the opposite bank. Gentle claps of encouragement, soft whistles, and careful guidance helped ensure the crossing remained steady. The river, though calm, carried quiet authority. Each boat's journey was deliberate, measured, a reflection of the meticulous preparation that defined Alexander's campaigns. As more soldiers crossed, the army formed a new line on the far shore, taking stock of terrain and arranging horses and equipment. The distant hills beckoned, their outlines softened by morning haze. Alexander rode along the line, offering quiet words of reassurance, his presence a calm anchor for men who had ventured far from home. Even as the crossing continued, the natural beauty of the Hellespont captivated him. The water reflected clouds tinged with soft pink, and distant trees swayed in a gentle breeze. The army moved not with haste, but with mindful purpose, each step deliberate, each horse carefully guided, each man observing both the river and one another. By afternoon, the final wave of cavalry had crossed. The soldiers regrouped, checking horses, adjusting armor, and resting briefly. Alexander stood on the bank, surveying the scene. He thought of the lands beyond, of cities that would challenge them, rivers to ford, forests to navigate. Yet today, the world had paused to allow safe passage, a gift of quiet reflection before the challenges ahead. The sun dipped lower, casting long golden shadows across the plains. Campfires began to glow along the riverbank, marking the end of a day of careful movement and success. Soldiers spoke in hushed tones, sharing food and tending to horses, while Alexander and Hephaestion walked among them, ensuring all were accounted for, observing the calm after exertion. Night fell over the river and the plains beyond. Stars appeared, mirrored faintly in the darkening water. Alexander reflected on the day, not with boastfulness, but with quiet recognition of coordination, courage, and the delicate balance of nature and human effort. The Hellespont was crossed. The first step into Asia had been made. And as sleep settled over the men and horses, the river whispered softly under the moonlight, carrying away yesterday's uncertainty and welcoming the unfolding journey of conquest, strategy, and quiet perseverance.
The march across rolling plains, Alexander's strategic advance. The morning mist lingered over the gently rolling plains, soft tendrils of fog drifting between low hills. The Macedonian army had resumed its march after the crossing of the Hellespont, moving steadily inland toward the unknown territories of Asia Minor. Alexander rode at the forefront, his posture calm, eyes scanning every rise and hollow, calculating, anticipating. The sun had begun to rise,
casting soft golden light over fields dotted with morning dew. The army moved like a single organism. Cavalry and infantry maintained their order, horses stepping carefully, soldiers adjusting armor and weapons, every movement measured and deliberate. The air was filled with the faint sound of hooves on grass, the rustle of armor, the soft commands of officers, and the distant cry of birds welcoming the new day. Alexander's thoughts drifted to the lands ahead, the cities, forests, and rivers that awaited. Each held its own challenges, yet today was not the day of confrontation. Today was a day of preparation, of surveying terrain, ensuring supplies and horses were in prime condition, and reinforcing the discipline that had made his army a force beyond mere numbers. Hephaestion rode alongside, his calm presence a constant reassurance. Together, they observed soldiers as they adjusted their formations to suit the rolling terrain. Hills offered vantage points. Shallow streams provided natural boundaries for the march. Alexander and Hephaestion moved carefully among them, offering quiet encouragement. The river did not rush. It allowed time for preparation, reflection, and measured action. By midday, the army had reached a plateau overlooking a wide valley. The sight was both beautiful and daunting. Fields stretched endlessly, dotted with scattered groves and distant settlements. The wind carried the subtle scent of wildflowers and grass, a gentle reminder that nature was as much a participant in this march as any soldier. Alexander observed quietly as scouts returned with information about the valley ahead. The Macedonian army maintained order, adjusting positions, ready to continue the advance while remaining alert. Horses grazed under watchful eyes, soldiers shared water and provisions, and a sense of calm focus settled over the men. As afternoon progressed, the light shifted, golden sunlight giving way to softer hues. Shadows lengthened across the plains, highlighting the contours of hills and streams. Alexander reflected on the delicate balance between action and patience, knowing that the decisions made now would shape the future of the campaign. By evening, the army had established a temporary camp on the higher ground, overlooking the valley they would traverse tomorrow. Fires glowed softly as soldiers prepared simple meals, tending horses and maintaining weapons. Alexander and Hephaestion walked among them, offering quiet words of guidance, ensuring morale and readiness were preserved. Night fell, the sky sprinkled with stars reflected faintly in nearby streams. The camp was calm, the soldiers resting peacefully under the watch of their leaders. Alexander sat near a small fire, reflecting on the day's progress, understanding that even in stillness, strategy and foresight were paramount. The march would continue at dawn, each step deliberate, each movement a testament to preparation, courage, and the quiet discipline that defined the Macedonian army. Through forested valleys, the Macedonian advance deepens. The morning light filtered softly through the dense canopy of the forested valley. Mist hung low among the trees, curling around the trunks like delicate threads of silver. Alexander's army moved carefully, horses stepping lightly over roots and soft earth, infantry adjusting their pace to the rhythm of the terrain. Every footfall was measured, every breath calm and deliberate. Alexander rode at the forefront, his posture poised yet relaxed, eyes scanning the dappled light and shadow for both opportunity and risk. The forest was alive with subtle sounds, the rustle of leaves, distant bird song, and the gentle murmur of a hidden stream. The Macedonian soldiers adapted seamlessly to the landscape, their discipline evident in the quiet coordination of infantry and cavalry. Hephaestion rode beside Alexander, the trusted general's eyes calm, assessing the men and terrain, signaling with slight gestures when necessary. The army's formations shifted subtly to navigate the narrow passes and clearings. Even in this complex environment, order was maintained, and each soldier knew his place, each horseman aware of the space he must occupy. As the army progressed, they encountered a small creek cutting through the valley. Engineers worked swiftly, placing planks and guiding horses through shallow waters. Alexander observed patiently, offering a quiet word to a struggling soldier, a gentle encouragement to calm a skittish horse. The careful pace was not weakness, it was preparation, a hallmark of the Macedonian advance. By midday, the army reached a clearing on a gentle rise, offering a sweeping view of the valleys ahead. The trees opened to reveal distant hills and winding paths, rivers glinting like silver threads through the landscape. Scouts returned with news of small groups of locals observing from afar, curious yet cautious. Alexander considered the reports silently, understanding that knowledge, timing, and subtle strategy could outweigh raw force. The soldiers rested briefly, attending to horses and weapons, sharing water and bread. Alexander moved among them, speaking softly, observing carefully, ensuring morale remained high and readiness uncompromised. Each pause in the march was purposeful, a balance between movement and reflection, between momentum and caution. As afternoon waned, the light turned golden, casting long shadows that stretched across the forest floor. The army continued onward, crossing shallow streams, moving through wooded patches, adjusting formations as necessary. Every step forward was deliberate, every glance calculated, as the Macedonian army pressed deeper into lands unfamiliar yet promising. Evening descended, painting the forest in shades of purple and gold. Camps were established along clearings, fires glowing warmly against the cool night air. Horses rested, soldiers prepared simple meals, and Alexander walked quietly among them, reflecting on the day's progress and the plans for the morrow. The forest held both shelter and challenge, and he knew that tomorrow would require both vigilance and wisdom. Night fell completely, stars twinkling above the canopy, reflected faintly in nearby streams. The camp settled into calm, the sounds of the forest mingling with quiet conversation and the occasional neigh of horses. Alexander stood at the edge of the camp, thoughtful yet serene, aware that each day brought them closer to both the lands and the destiny they sought to claim.
The narrow pass, Macedonian strategy in motion. The morning sun filtered through the narrow gaps of a rocky pass, casting long shadows over the jagged terrain. Alexander's army approached with caution, aware that the confined space could favor ambushes, yet confident in their discipline and preparation. The sounds of hooves striking stone and soldiers adjusting armor echoed softly, blending with the distant call of mountain birds. Alexander rode at the forefront, scanning every cliff edge and tree line, his sharp blue eyes noting every potential vantage point. The young king's posture was poised but relaxed, his movements deliberate. Behind him, Hephaestion moved with measured attention, signaling the infantry and cavalry to adjust formation as the pass narrowed. The Macedonian army, though not large, was a study in precision and cohesion, each soldier aware of the steps needed to navigate the challenging terrain safely. The soldiers proceeded carefully, adjusting their pace to the contours of the land. Engineers reinforced unstable paths and guided horses over uneven rocks. Alexander paused at a natural lookout, observing both the immediate terrain and the distant valley beyond. He considered the possibilities, potential ambush sites, optimal positions for archers,
and routes for a safe advance. By midday, the army reached a wider plateau within the pass. Scouts returned with reports of local observers, keeping distance yet noting the movement of the Macedonian forces. Alexander listened attentively, considering how best to proceed, balancing caution with the necessity of maintaining momentum. The disciplined pace of his troops demonstrated both patience and readiness for swift action if needed. Afternoon brought a gentle breeze and the warm glow of stone and grass. The Alexandrian army continued its advance, carefully navigating narrow stretches, crossing small streams, and moving past rocky outcrops. Each maneuver reflected Alexander's strategy: careful observation, calculated movement, and coordination between units. Even in challenging terrain, the army maintained its cohesion, a testament to rigorous training and inspired leadership. As evening approached, the army set camp near the edge of the pass. Fires glowed softly against the rocky slopes, illuminating the tired but alert soldiers. Horses rested quietly, and Alexander walked among the men, offering words of encouragement and reviewing plans for the next day's progression. The stillness of night was a contrast to the careful tension of the day, a moment for reflection before the march resumed. The stars emerged above, glittering against the deepening sky, and the gentle sounds of the mountain pass mingled with the low murmur of conversation and the occasional clink of armor. Alexander's thoughts were steady, considering both the immediate tactical needs and the broader campaign objectives. The Alexandrian advance pressed forward, each day bringing them closer to their ultimate goal, guided by leadership, strategy, and the quiet determination of a well-disciplined army.
The coastal approach, Alexander's naval strategy. The morning light reflected off the calm waters of the coast, shimmering in soft gold and silver hues. Alexander's army moved cautiously along the shoreline, aware that the enemy could observe from elevated cliffs above, yet confident in their ability to coordinate land and naval movements. The gentle sound of waves lapping against rocks and the faint cries of seagulls created a soothing rhythm as the soldiers marched. Alexander rode at the forefront, his sharp blue eyes scanning both the water and the cliffs. The young king's posture was poised, his expression calm yet focused, a balance between vigilance and serenity. Beside him, Hephaestion moved with quiet precision, signaling infantry and cavalry units to maintain formation while scouts carefully observed the terrain. The Macedonian navy was moored nearby, ships aligned along the shore, sails furled but ready. The integration of naval and land forces was a key advantage, allowing Alexander to secure supply lines while advancing along the coast. Observing the ships, Alexander considered how the placement of vessels could deter enemy movements and provide safe passage for his troops. Throughout the day, the army navigated rocky inlets, small streams, and narrow coastal paths. Soldiers adjusted their pace, ensuring that horses and equipment remained stable on uneven ground. Scouts returned with updates about enemy positions, and Alexander carefully weighed the information, preparing for both cautionary maneuvers and decisive actions. By evening, the army reached a small bay suitable for setting camp. Fires glowed softly, casting a warm light over horses, tents, and armor. Alexander walked among the soldiers, offering encouragement and reviewing plans for the next stage of the campaign. The rhythmic sound of the waves and the gentle night breeze created a peaceful atmosphere, offering a moment of reflection after the strategic complexities of the day. As darkness enveloped the coast, stars emerged above, mirrored faintly in the calm waters. The soldiers rested, alert but serene,
while Alexander and Hephaestion considered the next steps in their coastal approach, ensuring that every move would combine precision, coordination, and the element of surprise. The campaign continued with quiet determination, blending strategic calculation with the steady advance of a disciplined, well-led army.
The final crossing, Alexander's strategic triumph. The morning fog hovered gently over the strait, creating a veil of silver and soft gray. Alexander's army, poised at the shoreline, prepared for a final crossing that would determine the course of their campaign. The stillness of the water contrasted with the quiet anticipation of men and horses, each aware that precision, coordination, and courage were paramount. Alexander rode at the forefront, his golden cloak billowing gently in the morning breeze, blue eyes focused on the horizon. The young king exuded calm authority, guiding his officers with subtle gestures and concise instructions. Around him, Hephaestion and other senior generals moved with fluid confidence, ensuring each unit was in position and every plan was accounted for. The Macedonian navy, arrayed in disciplined lines, waited patiently. Ships with polished wooden hulls reflected the dawn light, while sailors prepared ropes, sails, and oars. Alexander's strategic mind considered every angle, the currents, enemy positions, the timing of landings, and the safety of the soldiers. As the day progressed, the army began its careful advance into the waters, soldiers balancing on the decks of ships, horses guided into shallow waves, and infantry maintaining formation across floating platforms. Each movement was deliberate, precise, and synchronized. The strait's calm surface belied the complexity of the operation, but Alexander's planning ensured minimal risk and maximal coordination. By evening, the final crossing was complete. The army assembled on the far shore, a mixture of relief, pride, and quiet satisfaction evident in their faces. Fires were lit, tents pitched, and supply lines secured. Alexander walked among his men, acknowledging their efforts, reflecting on the journey, and considering the next stage of the campaign. Stars appeared above, twinkling in the clear night sky, mirrored in the calm waters of the strait. The operation had succeeded not only because of numbers or strength, but because of careful planning, unity, and disciplined execution. The crossing was complete, the strategic victory secured, and the way forward into the heart of the campaign lay open.